Imagine thousands of people just throwing this massive ecstatic parade for a guy they genuinely believe is going to violently overthrow their oppressive government.
Right.
Like they are cheering, they're laying down their coats in the street, they are shouting his name. And then, I mean, just 5 days later, that exact same crowd is literally screaming for his public execution.
It was wild.
They want him tortured, they want him killed. What actually happens in the human brain in just, 120 hours to cause that kind of intense psychological whiplash?
Well, it is honestly one of the most extreme documented cases of cognitive dissonance turning into just, well, violent rejection.
Yeah.
When a crowd's deeply held expectations completely collide with a reality that undermines their whole narrative, the reaction is rarely just confusion. It's almost always rage.
Okay, let's unpack this, because that 120-hour window is the focal point of our deep dive today.
Yeah.
We're going to be examining an audio recording of a Palm Sunday sermon. This was delivered by Pastor Dan Sinkhorn at Shiloh Church in Jasper, Indiana. And the date of this recording is March 29, 2026.
Yeah, and it's a really rich source.
It is. And I want to say right up front, whether you are deeply religious, entirely secular, or anywhere in between, we are just mining this text today for its raw insights into human behavior.
Exactly.
We aren't looking at this to endorse a specific theological viewpoint. We're impartially analyzing the historical context, the psychological metaphors, and honestly, the deeply uncomfortable truths about how we try to bargain with the universe.
Yeah, because the human behaviors described here, the way crowds turn, the way we try to manipulate higher powers, how we prioritize our own comfort, I mean, those are universal patterns.
Totally.
They apply just as much to modern corporate culture or, political movements as they do to ancient religious history.
So true. So the sermon actually begins with a reading from the Gospel of Matthew chapter 21. It sets the historical scene of the triumphal entry into Jerusalem.
The Palm Sunday scene.
Right. The crowd is ecstatic. But they aren't just cheering for some popular local rabbi, There is this massive geopolitical and prophetic weight to this moment.
What's fascinating here is the subtle differences Pastor Dan points out regarding what they were expecting versus what they got.
Right, because they are quoting scripture, aren't they?
Yes, exactly. They are shouting Hosanna, and they're quoting the prophet Zechariah and reciting Psalm 118. And in the historical context of first-century Judea, that is highly specific, politically charged language.
It's a declaration.
It is. They're publicly announcing that they believe they're looking at the Son of David. They've been waiting generations for a new conquering king.
Like a warrior.
A warrior who is finally going to violently displace the Roman oppressors who are making their lives miserable.
They want King David 2.0. They're giving him this royal entry, laying palm branches on the road, which, fulfills a prophetic passage from 2 Kings.
Yep.
But the physical reality of what is actually happening completely undercuts the parade they're trying to throw.
The dissonance here is subtle, but it's massive. Because think about it. If you are a conquering king in the ancient world, you ride into a city on a war horse.
Right.
You project fear, dominance, military might. But Jesus arrives on a donkey, a beast of burden.
Right.
It's a visual rejection of military power. He's protecting servanthood, not conquest.
And there's a geographic layer to this, too, that makes the disconnect even sharper, right?
Yes. So while it's not explicitly spelled out in the Matthew text itself, Pastor Dan implies he entered the city using the same route used to drive sheep into Jerusalem for temple sacrifices.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. It's Passover week. Thousands of animals are being brought in through this gate. So he's aligning his arrival with the Passover sacrifices, not a military parade.
Because he knows his destination is a cross, not a throne.
Exactly.
It kind of makes me think of an analogy. Imagine a failing massive corporation where the employees have been oppressed by a terrible board of directors for years.
Okay, yeah.
And they hear this legendary cutthroat turnaround CEO has been hired to save them. So they gather in the lobby, they're cheering, they're expecting him to just storm into the corner office and fire all the executives.
Right, clean house.
But instead of taking the elevator to the penthouse, this guy quietly walks down into the basement, puts on a janitor's uniform, and just takes a job in the mailroom.
That is exactly it. And that dissonance, expecting a corporate raider and getting a mailroom clerk, it doesn't just cause confusion, it causes anger.
Because they feel duped?
They feel foolish. Their survival instincts are threatened by someone who refuses to play their game, someone who refuses to use his power the way they want him to.
Yeah.
And when humans feel that their core narrative is being mocked or ignored like that, they don't just walk away, they attack.
Which completely explains the violent shift to Friday. The same people shouting Hosanna on Sunday are the exact same people screaming crucify him by Friday.
Exactly.
So to explain the psychology behind this really rapid betrayal, Pastor Dan connects this historical event to a series he had been teaching on the wisdom of the desert.
Right, specifically the Desert Fathers and Mothers.
Yeah, tell us about them.
So these were early Christian monastics from the centuries right after the original apostles. They looked around at the emerging institutional church and just felt that the religion was becoming too civil.
Like it was too comfortable.
Too civil, too humanistic, and too secularized. It was basically being domesticated. So they deliberately fled the cities.
Wow.
They went out into the desolate wilderness to distill their faith down to its rawest, most uncomfortable truths.
And I guess one of those uncomfortable truths is the realization that human beings will turn on their Messiah in an absolute heartbeat if he stops giving them what they think they want.
Oh, absolutely. The crowd in Jerusalem ignored all the visual data. They ignored the donkey. They ignored the sheep gate.
They ignored his own warning.
They ignored Jesus' own explicit warnings about his impending death. They dismissed reality just so they could project their own desires onto him.
That is so human, though.
It is. And Pastor Dan brings this psychological mechanism right into the modern day with a really sharp critique of how people currently approach prayer.
Yeah, he calls it a purely transactional mindset. He says that people often pray as if they are, like, writing a letter to Santa Claus.
We're rubbing a genie's lamp.
Right, rubbing a lamp hoping a genie pops out to grant their wishes. We basically look up and say, look, here are my brilliant, flawless plans for my life. Please endorse them, ratify them in heaven, and then use your immense cosmic power to fund my ambitions.
It's the ultimate presumption. He even points the finger at his own profession.
Oh, yeah, the part about the clergy.
Yes. He describes clergy standing in front of congregations wearing these elaborate robes, essentially just asking God to bless their personal ambitions and their own legacy projects.
And the trap is when those projects inevitably get completed through sheer human willpower and organization, we lull ourselves into this false security that God has blessed our plans.
When really we just executed a really good business strategy.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. If we look at this from a purely evolutionary standpoint, isn't this transactional mindset just a foundational human survival instinct?
How do you mean?
Well, we're primates hardwired to seek security, victory, and the elimination of threats to our tribe, right?
Sure.
So, of course, when we conceptualize a higher power, we naturally project those survival desires onto that power. We want a God who secures our borders, protects our kids, fills our bank accounts. Why is it inherently wrong to ask a higher power to secure the perimeter?
Well, it is an entirely natural survival instinct, you're right. But Pastor Dan argues it is spiritually lethal because it reduces the divine to a vending machine.
Ah, a vending machine.
Right. It centers the universe on your ego and your definition of what is good. He suggests that God quietly watches these human plans run their course without interfering.
Because we need to learn from them?
Because there is often a much more profound lesson to be learned in the failure of our ambitions than in their success. The rejection by the crowd wasn't an accident.
It was the prophetic expectation all along.
Exactly. God allows the survival instinct to play out, knowing it's going to lead to the crowd shaking their fists and demanding a crucifixion, because exposing that dark transactional nature is the very first step to actually curing it.
Which forces the question, right? If our default hardwired setting is to be transactional and self-serving, how do we actually fix it? How do we rewrite the code?
So Pastor Dan turns to the concept of being born again, and he references the historical dialogue between Jesus and Nicodemus.
Right. Nicodemus gets really confused by that phrase.
He's a literalist?
Yeah.
He is completely baffled by the metaphor. He's asking how an old man can literally re-enter a womb.
Yeah, which is kind of a funny visual.
It is. But the text is talking about a complete ground-up reorientation of the heart, mind, and soul. It's the agonizing process of letting go of your pride and accepting that your entire worldview regarding victory, defeat, and security might be fundamentally backwards.
He anchors this concept with this super striking diagnostic quote from St. Augustine. He says, "We live disordered lives because we have disordered loves."
That is such a powerful line.
I really want to linger on the mechanics of that phrase. Because Augustine isn't saying we love evil things. He is saying we love good things. We love our families, our communities, our careers, our personal safety. But the disorder, the chaos in our lives, happens because we love those things more than we love the divine truth.
The hierarchy is out of order.
Exactly.
The prioritization is what causes the psychological and spiritual chaos. If your highest love is your own financial security, then your relationship with any higher power or even your own ethical compass is always going to be conditional.
Yeah, it's dependent on your wallet.
It'll be entirely dependent on whether that power or those ethics threaten or protect your bank account. And the moment the divine asks you to sacrifice your security, you will turn into that Friday crowd and scream for a crucifixion.
Pastor Dan gets incredibly vulnerable here to illustrate exactly how insidious this is. He shares this personal anecdote from over 30 years ago.
Oh, the one about entering the ministry.
Yeah, so at the time, he was a father of 5 young children, and 2 of his children had disabilities. And he tells his counselor that he is willing to go into ministry, but he sets a strict condition right out of the gate.
Right.
He refuses to be sent to an inner-city church because he's worried about his children's physical safety.
Which, honestly, to any rational listener, sounds like the exact definition of good, responsible parenting.
Huh.
You protect your vulnerable kids.
Anyone would say that. But Pastor Dan looks back at that moment and realizes it was the ultimate textbook example of a disordered love.
Wow.
His love for his children's physical safety was superseding his trust in his calling. He was essentially looking upward and saying, I will give you everything. I will surrender my life to you except for this one specific thing I refuse to let go of.
He was trying to dictate the terms of his surrender.
It's like downloading a massive new operating system for your phone, right? One that promises to fix all the bugs and fundamentally change how the device works.
Okay, I like this analogy.
So the terms and conditions pop up, and instead of just scrolling to the bottom and clicking agree, you print out the 100-page document, take a red pen, and cross out Clause 4, Paragraph B, because it asks for location access.
Right.
And then you try to hand it back to the developer, and the developer is going to say, no, a fundamental reorientation requires full system access. You don't get to cherry pick the upgrade.
That's spot on. And to grant that full system access, to fix those disordered loves, Pastor Dan says we have to find our desert place.
Like the Desert Fathers.
Exactly. Though he clarifies that he doesn't necessarily mean hiking out into a literal desolate wilderness, although he admits he did exactly that as an adventure-seeking youth, just disappearing into the woods for days.
Right.
But practically speaking, for the modern listener, the desert is just a metaphor for intentionally hitting the reset button on your life.
And he uses the most relatable, slightly painful tech analogy for this. Drawing on his time as a computer guy in his 20s, he compares this spiritual reset to dealing with the groundbreaking but deeply glitchy operating system known as Windows 95.
I can hear the collective sigh of anyone who lived through the 1990s.
Yeah. So he says that when people would ask for IT help, the classic advice was, have you tried turning it off and turning it back on again?
Naturally.
But sometimes a simple reboot just wasn't enough. The corruption in the registry was too deep. The system was too bogged down with malware and fragmented files. You couldn't just restart.
You had to wipe it.
You had to completely wipe the hard drive and reinstall the software from absolute scratch. He jokingly admits he used to call this the Windows Enema 95.
Oh my God.
Which is just such a funny phrase to use from a pulpit. He felt a little bashful using it, but it's the perfect metaphor for the total system purge required to get a human life back in working order.
And he takes this practice very seriously. He tells the congregation that he literally did this just last summer. Really? Yeah. With the blessing of his church leadership, he entered a period of intentional, extended isolation. He wiped his own hard drive, inviting a total reset of his priorities. And he notes that the clarity it brought has profoundly impacted both him and the Shiloh church community ever since.
See, I have to push back on the logistics of this, though.
Okay, why?
Because in our modern, hyper-connected world where everyone has a smartphone in their pocket, Slack messages pinging 24/7, endless algorithmic feeds is a literal isolation period, like packing a bag, leaving your family, and going off-grid truly necessary.
That's a fair question.
Or is finding the desert really more about the psychological mechanism of reclaiming our mental bandwidth? Like, can we find the desert without leaving our living rooms?
The geographical isolation is just a tool, honestly.
Yeah.
The actual mechanism of the desert is cognitive unburdening.
Okay, cognitive unburdening.
Yeah. The original Desert Fathers fled the cities because, in their era, the city was the only place the noise existed. Today, the noise is algorithmic. It lives in our pockets.
We carry the city with us.
Exactly. The constant trickle charge of dopamine and information from our screens keeps our brains in a state of perpetual reaction. You are constantly responding to inputs, which means you have zero cognitive bandwidth left to examine your own deeper motives.
You can't diagnose a disordered love if you are constantly distracted by a screen.
You just can't. You don't have to go to the Sahara. You just have to intentionally starve the brain of that artificial input. Turn off the notifications. Sit in silence.
You sit there.
Yes. The psychological mechanism of the desert is about stopping the endless flow of external narratives so you can finally hear the terrifying volume of your own internal monologue. That is how you perform the Windows 95 wipe.
And confronting that internal monologue is exactly what he challenges the congregation to do as Holy Week approaches.
Yes.
He asks his listeners to use the historical events of the Passion, the arrest, the trial, the crucifixion, not just as a story to listen to, but as a deeply uncomfortable psychological mirror.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, he doesn't want passive observers. He challenges the listener to find their own flaws reflected in the historical characters.
He goes down the list, and it is a tough diagnostic tool. He asks, like, are you Peter? Meaning, do you deny your friendships or your core beliefs because in the heat of the moment you are terrified of the social consequences where they hit to your reputation?
Ouch.
Right? Or are you Judas? Are you willing to betray someone because you felt misled, because they didn't turn out to be the political or financial asset you thought they were?
The mirror gets even darker. He asks, are you the apostle who just ran away into the garden in sheer panic, abandoning all loyalty for self-preservation?
Yeah.
Or are you the violent defender who pulls a sword and cuts off the ear of the temple guard?
Okay.
The one relying entirely on human violence and aggression instead of trusting a higher plan.
And he doesn't stop there. Moving to the execution itself, he asks, are you the mocker? Are you the one standing in the crowd ridiculing someone because they refuse to use their power to fix your immediate temporal problems?
It's intense.
He even asks the ultimate question, could you be the one driving the nails into the wrists and feet?
Yeah, that's heavy.
His point is that if you actually allow yourself to engage in this exercise, if you honestly look for your own survival instincts and disordered loves in these historical figures, it will trigger that system wipe.
It forces you to contemplate what you actually value. Do you just, like, the social club aspect of attending a church? Do you just enjoy the aesthetic of the building and the comfort of the tradition? Or have you actually allowed your mind to be fundamentally reoriented?
So what does this all mean? Which brings us to his highly practical post-Easter challenge, because he warns the congregation against treating Easter Sunday as a finish line.
Right.
He explicitly calls out the temptation to just pig out on an Easter basket full of chocolate. He references this long-running joke he makes about the church fish fry.
It's a fish fry joke, yeah.
He says, do not treat the end of a Lenten season like the end of a crash diet, where you just gorge yourself and say, well, I survived that. Back to my normal habits for another year.
Because if the desert is just a temporary vacation from your normal transactional life, it didn't work.
It failed.
For Pastor Dan, the desert rhythms, his congregation practiced intentional prayer, studying texts, seeking out absolute silence, practicing self-denial. These aren't supposed to be temporary challenges. They're supposed to be the new operating system.
Yes.
His challenge is to pick at least one of those desert practices and commit to maintaining it long term. Hold yourself accountable to keeping the noise dialed down permanently.
He closes the sermon with a succinct historical prayer from St. Augustine that really encapsulates the entire journey. The prayer asks for 3 simple yet incredibly difficult things. Let me know myself and know you. Let me die to myself and live in you. Let me cling to nothing save only you.
Cling to nothing save only you. It is the ultimate expression of reordering your loves.
It really is.
It means you have finally stopped handing the universe a list of terms and conditions. You've stopped demanding the warhorse and accepted the donkey.
We've traced a pretty fascinating arc today. I mean, we started with the violent psychological whiplash of a crowd whose expectations were subverted.
Yep.
We explored that deeply ingrained genie complex that turns our highest ideals into a transactional vending machine. We diagnosed how our totally natural survival instincts lead to disordered loves, where we prioritize our own security over deeper truths.
And we examine the absolute necessity of finding a modern-day desert to perform that internal Windows 95 wipe.
Exactly, shutting down the noise to reclaim our mental bandwidth.
The historical text provides the framework, but the challenge is entirely modern. Whether you approach this from a pew or from a purely secular, psychological standpoint, the mandate to examine your own motives is unavoidable.
Truly.
Are your values in the correct order, or is the relentless noise of algorithmic culture dictating what you love?
Think about the last time you desperately hoped for a specific outcome in your life. Were you open to the reality of the situation, or were you essentially handing the universe a pre-written business plan and demanding funding?
That's a great way to put it.
It is so easy to get caught up in the current of your own ambitions, assuming that getting exactly what you want is the definition of a successful life.
But consider this final thought to mull over, building on the psychology we've discussed today. If our greatest historical and personal failures come from getting exactly what we think we want, like a crowd demanding a warrior king and ending up complicit in a tragedy, what are the one deeply held ambition you are currently chasing that might actually be the very thing blinding you to a more meaningful path?
You can't always see the fractures in your own expectations. Sometimes the diagnosis isn't visible on a clean x-ray. It is hidden in the murky waters of what we absolutely refuse to let go of. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the noise, keep seeking your desert, and we'll see you next time.